Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. We are at the auditorium at Cubo Itaú in São Paulo. And thank you if you're watching from the MZ Group webcast, which is broadcasting in Portuguese and English. So we'll begin the first edition of the Port and Maritime Equities Day Brazil 2022. So first off, I would like to congratulate these three companies for this initiative. They are landmarks in Brazilian port structure: Wilson Sons, Hidrovias do Brasil, and Santos Brasil. This will be a presentation that will discuss our perspectives in the industry in Brazil, our plans for the next months, and what we expect from Brazil and from the international market in 2023. And we are doing it together in an integrated fashion. I think this is a great reflection. If you work with logistics, you know how important it is to have integrated initiatives. So these presentations will also carry synergies and be integrated. I'd like to thank our financial analysts here at the auditorium and those of you also watching online. I'd also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be here. The B News a newspaper and platform has invited me to be the mediator for this event. And now we'll begin the first session where we will have the three CFOs from the three companies. They'll tell us about their projects and how their companies are doing in the market currently. So let's invite them to the table. We have the CFO from Wilson Sons, Fabricia Souza. Also Daniel Dorea, CFO from Santos Brasil. And Ricardo Pereira, CFO of Hidrovias Brazil. I'll now pass it over to Daniel Dorea from Santos Brasil, who will speak first. This is great. Good afternoon, everyone. Those of you watching in person or online. I think that this is a great initiative. We have three major companies who lead their businesses in this same industry, and we're here together to talk about the industry as a whole and not about our own companies. We have many convergences and many points in common when you work in Brazilian infrastructure, especially in the maritime industry. So I've been in Santos Brasil for 25 years, and they are, of course, children next to Wilson Sons, which has existed for 185 years. This will be a very brief presentation. Santos Brasil began in 1997 with a container terminal in the port of Santos, and their strategy has evolved significantly. We have a clearer strategy to maximize the value generation of our port assets for the company. We have three major pillars that now make up Santos Brasil. The company's DNA is in containers and general cargo. We have one of the biggest vehicle terminals in Brazil, and we have three container terminals which are geographically spread across the country: Santos, Vila do Conde in northern Brazil, and Irituba in the southern part of Brazil. So for a logistics company, we have two customs terminals in the Santos port on both sides. We also have a fleet, and we are prepared for services in the port of São Paulo, integrating the entire path from the port to their door. We're now going into a new segment, which seems to be very attractive to us, which is the liquid bulk warehousing and transportation industry. So we came in with 3 terminals in the Itaqui port, which benefits significantly from Brazilian agribusiness, especially in the Matopi area, the states of Maranhão, Tocantins, and Piauí. 2 of these terminals are brownfield. So we started their operations 3 years ahead of our original business plan. This month, we signed the first contract, and our aim is to continue growing in this industry. We know that the liquid bulk segment can contribute significantly to the company's results and within 5 years. So how do we get there? How can Santos Brasil stand out? What do we see when we look inside the company and not to the entire market? Client experience, we have a lot of human capital, and we provide services, meaning that our competitive edge are people. Of course, in infrastructure, assets are also a strength, but here we invest significantly in people. Customer experience, as I said, the customer is always at the core of everything we do at the company. From when it was created, since it was not integrated, since it was not a verticalized company in the chain, we need to have clients at the core. ESG is something we will discuss a little bit later, but just to say it now, we have been focusing on ESG for over a decade. Technology and innovation are also our enablers. If you have capital, you have access to the same sort of equipment. So innovation is what makes you stand out and gives you a competitive edge. Financial discipline, and of course, regulatory expertise, since we are in a regulated market. This is our commercial agenda. How is Santos Brasil positioning itself? So here we will discuss the container segment, which represents about 70 to 75% of the company's results. We are leaders in transporting and operating containers in Brazil. In terminals, we represent 8.4% in the Brazilian throughput measured in TEUs, 3 percentage points of market share gains from 2017 to 2022, and we have bonds with all ship owners in the world. We have 15 clients, Maersk, CGM, MSC, everyone, and we treat them all equally. For us, they are all equally important and relevant. And in the port of Santos, the company has become a market leader again. We have a 40% market share of the port of Santos. And this is what has allowed us to service our customers efficiently, quickly, with a very high level of productivity. This is something because that we need to state, because even in moments in which our results were lower, our productivity has never gone down. 100 movements or maneuvers per hour in Tecon Santos is what makes us stand out. We were able to increase our average ticket in our key and warehousing operations. We have autonomous and independent pricing, which is not connected to any commercial areas. We do a lot of data analysis, trying to choose our battles in the hot zones. We have good customer segmentation, and pricing supports our decisions. So we are market leaders, and we're becoming, again, the price makers in our main segment. And now let's talk about capital allocation. What do we seek in that strategy I mentioned in the beginning? This is a company that invests. We have invested nearly 1 billion Brazilian reals. So I'm running the numbers here before anyone else starts adding them up. I have the two last months of 2022. So next year we should have an additional 600 million in investments in infrastructure. Our business is anticipating the demand curve and having capacities in place to meet. And the long and short, which is what we usually call it in the company, is crucial. Because if you get the demand and if you don't have enough capacity, you can't start investing, because usually investments are medium to long term. So we have a very strong investment agenda in current assets, but you also consider payouts to shareholders. Santos Brasil is back, and it is now a major dividend payer. We did go through a more difficult moment in the company, but in 2021 we paid out 258 million in earnings, and in the first 9 months we paid 522 million Brazilian reals. And I can't spoil for the next quarter, but if we continue in the same line, we will probably have some more. So the company is also here to service its shareholders. But of course, we cannot forget about our investments, because they need to generate some returns in Tecon Santos and Itaqui. And since we still have a very deleveraged balance, since we are a net cash company, we can still keep our eye on inorganic growth opportunities, M&As. But of course, we need to have financial discipline. It's easy to lose money in M&As, despite the sex appeal that there is in having an acquisition. But of course, we should not let go of our financial discipline, because this is at our core. This is our ESG agenda. I could not leave it out. This is a value that we hold very strongly in the company, but it's also a social demand from the world of capital as well. I didn't want to include it as a fad. To give you an idea, this is the 14th sustainability report that we've put out as a company following global standards. So we started a long time ago with this agenda, but we do have some very clear objectives. From 2020 to 2024, reduce CO2 emissions by 15%, water consumption by 30%, and waste generation by 50%. If we look at the social dimension, we have 27 projects with 9,000 people benefited by these projects. We have an educational program for low-income people, and we've graduated 15 classes. And this gives them a job opportunity, not necessarily at Santos Brasil, but in the labor market. We want to train and graduate people, not for our company, but for the entire country. On the governance end, we are a company that has very high corporate governance standards. When we had our IPO in 2016, we were level 2. In 2016, we migrated to Novo Mercado and we extinguished our shareholder agreement. So any shareholder in Santos Brasil is now free to trade its shares. With the one share, one vote system, each share represents one vote. So we have 8 members on our board. We have male and female VPs, and they're independent. We do have discussions at the board, but we often come out with a single solution and a consensus. So no one is banging on the table to tell us how decisions should be made and followed. We have an audit committee now, an independent fiscal council, which is permanent, and we have a very strong compliance program. So our ESG agenda is also a part of our daily agenda. It's also a part of the goals we have as a company, and that's paid off. The company has been selected as a great place to work. It's certified, and it gives opportunities for people to grow in the company. In 2022, we received a few other awards: Institutional Investor, Epoca 360, Exame, and so on. Epoca 360 made us very happy because we were awarded as the best company in the infrastructure industry, competing against all other names in that industry. So that's what I had to say. I had very few slides because I didn't want to go over time, but I'd just like to give some time to Ricardo Pereira from Hidrovias do Brasil for his statements. Go ahead, Ricardo. Here we have the CFO of Hidrovias Brazil. Thank you, everyone, and we'll continue our conversation soon.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all well. Let me talk about Hidrovias. We're very pleased to be sharing the stage with two other major infrastructure companies. When you put them all together, we can make a huge difference in our country. That's the purpose of this panel. All right, let me start by talking about Hidrovias for a minute. I could give you a track record. You know the company very well. I could do that. But I'd rather talk about the development thesis. We were founded based on three major pillars. Number one, believing in the strong growth and the global demand of commodities coming out of Latin America. Those of you in the business may correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we have the largest growth of commodities in the world. We begin envisioning that potential, monitoring the growth of that production in Brazil. Number two, an infrastructure bottleneck. We know that our production strength grows much faster than our logistics infrastructure, not only in Brazil, but also in Latin America. So when you look at the huge potential for growth and that major bottleneck, of course, there's an opportunity there. And finally, and it's only obvious, it's in the name, we have over 42,000 kilometers of rivers in Brazil, and that extension is poorly used. When you look at the Mississippi River in the US, for example, you can clearly see that there's a huge potential for transportation purposes. Okay, the three pillars: commodities, bottleneck, and the capacity to use rivers for transportation. And then we decided to put together this company to help the country develop. Hidrovias is the most economical and sustainable means to transport commodities in South America mainly, but in all of Latin America. And it's more efficient. When I talk about efficiency, I like to bring that number to bear. And it may seem scary at first. It's much better now. The sound is much better now. One of our convoys can push 25 barges. They can carry each 20,000 tons worth of commodities or grains, depending on the density, of course. Each barge is the equivalent of 1,250 trucks. Think about that size and how efficient that transportation means can be. This is the most efficient and sustainable means. When you compare CO2 emissions, railway, highway, and river, at Hidrovias, we have 4 grams per kilometer per ton. Railways, that number goes up to 14. When you take into account highways, it reaches 16. So the difference is huge. We do believe in the efficiency and how much value we can bring to our customers, as well as the sustainable impact we have in our business. I'll have to change the slides now. Shifting gears. Well, what does that mean? That's our vocation, and I like that word. We are going to connect and develop the entire continent. It may seem silly, but our ambition is to help develop the country, thinking about alternatives and break those bottlenecks and come up with a way more sophisticated transportation matrix, which is key to our development. It's our destiny, indeed. These pictures are just incredible. That's very clear. That exemplifies what I've been trying to say. Okay, moving on. Who are we? We have over 480 vessels and barges. We've developed them in our tugboats and push boats, taking into account the characteristics of all the rivers in which we operate. We have a very diversified operation system that includes agriculture, oars, and now operating in the port of Santos. I'll be talking about that shortly. We're now importing salt and fertilizers. We are geographically diversified and also diversified as far as commodities go. These are the 4 major corridors. Up north, there's an operation that brings all the agricultural production in northern Mato Grosso from highways, or through highways. We go all to the Miritituba port, about 1,000 kilometers, all the way to Barcarena. That's the route for agricultural commodities in Mato Grosso. And then we have cabotage system transporting bauxite from the Trombetas port for export purposes. Down south, we have MCR structure coming off of Corumbá, that's for iron ore, all the way to San Nicolás, Nova Palmyra, for exports purposes or for the domestic consumption, and also to Argentina. And more recently, we began to, well, it's been 3 years. We have that terminal in Santos. We shut that down for renovation purposes, and we're now back in operation 3 months ago, August, September. It was operational again. So these are very modern terminals. I'll be talking about some innovation characteristics of those terminals. There are 3 of them, 2 to import fertilizers and 1 for salt. Well, this is who we are in a nutshell. I would like to also take this opportunity to mention two other advantages we have. We have long-term contracts that helps us out during some troublesome times. We have long-term contracts in the take or pay model, over 11 billion reals for the next 19 years. And on top of that, we are a low capex company. We don't have to invest in assets in our rivers. We don't have to create rivers or maintain them. So structurally, we are a low capex company. That helps us in the long run. We can become more and more competitive, supporting our customers with very competitive and attractive prices, as well as conditions. Let me now talk about the direct impact. It's still a very young company. We've been in the business for 12 years. We have constant growth, substantial growth for that matter. When you look at any one of these numbers, especially revenues and EBITDA, this year, despite the challenging situations in the southern rivers, Paraná, Paraguay system, I think you've seen that, the drought problems we had in recent years, and we're not back to normal numbers yet. Year to date, we have revenue and EBITDA greater than all of the previous years. So when you compare the full year, we still have 3 months to go. We're not giving you any guidance. We cannot. So this is a growth year. That's part of our business, to grow, to move ahead. We're still maturing all the investments we have made recently in the company, and at the same time maximizing return on capital. With the same assets, low level of investment, we have been able to increase profitability and the company's revenues, reaching very high levels in our corridors. And in conclusion, let me talk about our destiny, our calling. We have been operating this company as a development company, a technology-oriented company. Let me give you 3 recent examples. There are many others, if you look at the entire history of the company, but we have 3 of them of sustainability and technology investment, since we are at Cubo, a place for innovation. We are developing the first electric push boats. We're bringing that technology over to Brazil, and there is a direct impact, not only in terms of energy efficiency, but a more direct consequence, which is the reduction of CO2 emissions. I mentioned at the beginning that each convoy had 25 barges. We're now starting using Super Convoy that has 35 barges. That's the equivalent of 1,650 trucks. I said that 25 was 1,000. This is 1,600. Those tractor trailer, 1,650 of those. With the same team, the same push boat, the same staff, the same cycle, we can now carry an additional 10 barges. So the impact is huge in terms of operational efficiency, and there is a direct impact in the reduction of CO2 emissions. I'll be talking about that on the right side of the chart when I talk about sustainability. And now moving on to Santos, I talked about the technology. In Santos, we are now introducing the first big electric cranes in the port of Santos. You don't have those cable cranes anymore. You have to be very careful. It twists and there's a direct impact when it's windy. So these cranes are hydraulic/electric. So the discharge cycle is much faster. It's about 50 seconds to 1 minute cycles. The old cranes will take up to 2 minutes. So it's a 50% efficiency gain. That's the way we think. That's our rationale as to how to develop new technological solutions. We want to invest more, to have higher capex, but at the same time, making sure you have an appropriate return on capital and a much smaller OPEX so that you can have more efficiency in the end that can be also shared with your customers. And finally, the direct impact on sustainability. The heart of the company is sustainable. It's a mode that is way more sustainable than the alternatives. At the same time, we have been able to evolve internally based on these 6 pillars. I'm not going to name all of them, but recently we have announced very daring goals to be net zero by 2030. We are looking for operational efficiency, but also to have a positive and direct impact on sustainability. So in conclusion, my takeaway message is that we do believe in the development and the impact of river transportation can contribute to the country. With partners that are heavyweight, we can have that daring ambition to change the world for the better. I'll turn over to Fabricia Souza to take us from here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. It's a pleasure to be at this forum, and I hope that this is the first of many events like this. I'm here to give you a general overview of what the Wilson Sons Group represents. Now we have the right presentation. All right, so the Wilson Sons Group is a Brazilian company founded 185 years ago. I think there are very few companies in Brazil that have operated for this long. We have a national presence. We are the largest integrated provider of port and maritime logistics in the country. Our client portfolio has over 5,000 clients, and that includes ship owners, importers and exporters, the agribusiness industry, natural commodities, mineral commodities, the energy industry. So we have a very extensive portfolio. Within our assets, we have high quality assets with great operational efficiency and excellence. We operate 2 container terminals, one in Rio Grande do Sul and one in Salvador. These are the 2 terminals of this nature that operate in their states. Both of them have high quality infrastructure, and they are prepared to receive 366 vessels, which are the next ones after the ones that Brazil receives in other ports post-Panamax. And they are among the 50 most efficient ports in the world. In towage, we are leaders. We are present at all main ports of Brazil. So we're present across the country with a fleet of 80 tugboats, the biggest in Brazil. Not only is it the biggest fleet, but it's also the most powerful, most modern, and most sustainable fleet in the country. The last series of tugboats being built in our shipyards are using European gas emission standards and a kind of technology and design that allows you to reduce the consumption of fuel by 14%. To give you an idea, about half of any vessels in the Brazilian coast are serviced by a Wilson tugboat. Moving forward, I'd like to tell you a bit about the main demand driver that we have for our business, which is the Brazilian trade flow. Our business is extremely exposed to any trade flow coming to Brazil or leaving the country. This means that our results are very solid and very resilient. If you look at this, you can notice that trade flow in Brazil has grown consistently over the last years at a percentage above the GDP. But there's still a lot of room to grow. If we consider trade flows as a percentage of the GDP in each country, in Brazil, our average is 25%. Our neighbors in Latin America have an average of 50%. And this shows how much we can grow in our trade flow. The good side about all of this is that any changes to the flow will create a positive impact to our business, whether it is through receiving containers in our container terminals or by servicing tugboats in all vessels arriving on the Brazilian coast, transporting this huge amount of cargo that drives our economy. And it includes ores, fuels, all commodities. So what are the main business dynamics that propel Wilson? We're based on several maritime and port segments, but we have 5 factors that we believe make our short-term results solid, consistent, and resilient, but also bring sustainability on the long run, giving us positive growth perspectives. So the first are the markets we're working in. I mentioned the Brazilian trade flows, which are an important driver, but I should also mention the percentage of container cargo in Brazil. It is still very low. If you look at the volume of TEUs per 1,000 inhabitants, in Brazil, we are at a very low level, about 48. In Latin America, it's 76, and the global average is close to 100. So that shows how much we can still grow. If we consider that both container terminals that we operate in Brazil still have idle capacities, it demonstrates that a part of this growth can be absorbed by our terminals without requiring any major investments in infrastructure. Another important point here is that Wilson Sons is also exposed to the oil and gas industry. We have a joint venture for support of vessels in offshore platforms and support bases. And this market has been recovering and has a very significant recovery perspective. The recovery we've seen this year has a good outlook because the Brazilian projects that we have in this area are among the most competitive in the world, whether it is in production cost, production volume, or even product quality. Pre-salt oil is very high quality, as you all know. Our assets are long-term. The 2 terminals that we currently operate have had their concessions renewed for 50 years, into which we have a consolidated leading position, and it's not only a leading market share. Here, we're referring to being leaders in technology, safety, and operational standards. Wilson Sons has a very consistent history. We're always the first to bring technologies to Brazil. Wilson Sons was the first to bring a single tugboat to Brazil, setting the global standard of operations and safety. We are currently operating a core, which is a tugboat operations center, where all of our fleet, with all the vessels on the Brazilian coast, are monitored 24/7. And besides that, in this center, we have a lot of technology and a lot of intelligence. We use big data, artificial intelligence, in order to plan our operations and maneuvers in the most efficient way possible. So obviously, it increases our operational excellence, but it also reduces fuel consumption, gas emissions, and it allows you to have a more predictable operation, which creates safety for everyone involved. The third point here, which is also very important, is that since we have operated for so long in Brazil, we've gone through several financial crisis cycles in Brazil and around the world. Throughout these cycles, we were able to show with our results how resilient and stable our financial results have been. And another point that contributes towards that is our US dollar denominated cash generation, which creates a natural hedge for our results. Meaning that the shareholder remuneration that we have paid out has remained stable at an attractive and predictable level, especially in the last 6 years. And as the final point on the slide worth mentioning are our high governance and safety standards. Wilson is listed in Novo Mercado and B3. We're in several governance indexes here, and our safety standards are world class. In the last 12 years, our accident rate with time away from work has been under 0.5, which is a global standard. We have several initiatives in this agenda. We were recently recognized as a great place to work, which shows the company's ability of attracting and retaining talents. We are at the Standard & Poor's portfolio in ESG, and that helps us understand where we are in this journey and what direction we're headed in. And it also allows us to focus and prioritize initiatives, and we have several for this year and for next year. So I think that concludes my presentation. Thank you for your time, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of this event. Thank you. Thank you to the CFO from the CFO of the Wilson Sons Group, Fabrício Souza. And this concludes the first part of the Port and Maritime Equities Day Brazil 2022. We'll now continue with the second part with the CEOs from all three companies who will give presentations, answer questions, and then we will have a panel. Questions can be sent, can be asked by those of you here in person, or if you're watching us online through the MZ Group's portal, through their webcast. So I'd like to invite to the stage the CEO from Santos Brasil, Valdo Sepúlveda, the CEO from Hidrovias do Brasil, Fábio Scutino, and the CEO from Wilson Sons, Fernando Salek. Gentlemen, thank you for being here, and I think we can start with a question for all three. I'd like to hear your opinion on how important it is for the infrastructure industry to continue working towards the development of our country, and what challenges do you face in that area? So let's start with Antonio Sepúlveda from Santos, Brazil. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Leopoldo. It's a pleasure to be here and to share this panel with Fabio and Salak. Santos Brasil, Wilson, and Hidrovias are an example of capitalism working in Brazil. We have modern companies that can capture resources from the equities market if we need, without needing any help from the government to capture wealth and distribute wealth. So Brazil has progressed significantly in the last 4 years. There were many achievements during this time. Brazil had gaps that were getting very difficult for logistics. You know, when we talk about logistics, we're not talking about airports or ports or roads. We're talking about all of them. So if you have ports without railways, it doesn't matter if you're investing on your ports because you're not going to get bulk cargo to your ports. If you don't have waterways, if you don't have navigability, you're restricted to road transportation. So what we saw in the last few years was that the different modes of transportation were equalized. So we had investments in railways, in dredging, in removing some red tape from port authorities. Several investments were made across all regulatory agencies, and this brought Brazil to a different level. So it was a virtuous cycle. We have a better infrastructure. We're receiving or we're transporting cargo at a better cost, which brings in more cargo, makes Brazil more competitive, increases our market share in international trade. If you look at our participation curve in foreign trade, it's growing. Brazil 10 or 15 years ago only had 10% of its GDP there, but now it's much higher. But this is in the past. We now have to look forward and see what we need to do. Discussing the port industry, I think Brazil is still over-regulated. It's amazing how we really like old laws. We need to rethink everything. We need to change anything. And the world of capital doesn't like this. It likes stability. It likes understanding its regulatory risks. And our industry is really very difficult. With each new administration, regulations change, laws change, and that impacts all regulatory agencies. So that's an important point. Regulatory stability is an important point. I think this would make our industry really much more attractive. An additional problem that we have is taxation. Brazil is very confusing. Some states work as tax havens for state taxes, so you can often go to Santa Catarina to then have your cargo transported to Minas or São Paulo. And I think the challenge that we have in transferring cargo across all different modes of transportation with simple, fast, and agile documents is something that we will need to face. And there are two tax reforms in bills in Congress, excuse me. So this means that if you are able to do something, you have to continue doing it for a long time so that you don't affect whoever is doing it now. So that affects everyone. It creates huge direct costs for investments in Brazil and transporting cargo. But I think Brazil is at a privileged position right now. This is a world of 8 billion inhabitants, and Brazil has already occupied a lot of its land for agribusiness. It generates wealth and high value cargo. Our GDP is growing, pulled up by agribusiness. You have container transportation. So it's a great moment for Brazil. Santos Brazil has existed for 25 years. When it started in 1997, maybe you would never imagine that a container terminal had to be in the port for 20 days. Currently, if it takes 30 hours, clients start to complain. So that gives you a perspective of how much we have moved forward in Brazil. The world continues to advance. We have challenges and technology. We no longer talk about data exchange. We talk about APIs, and this is changing very quickly. And we really have to be able to keep track of that. So I think this is the last fine tuning that we still have to make. If we're able to go through this administration without changing any laws, I think it will be a huge victory.
You've talked about a lot of regulations and the discrepancies. Do you believe that the political and economic scenario in Brazil can come up with positive solutions? Or is it the private sector mature enough to claim for those changes or ask for them? While our democracy is modern and it's functional, I believe that the business sector is way more united and organized to fight for their interests in a very Republican fashion, if I may. And I truly believe that society will be able to influence Congress. I believe that the tax reform is a much more complex topic. But if we come out of this new administration with a better regulation system, that's going to be great. As far as ports are concerned, we were very close to privatizing the port authorities. That's a very positive trend. Whenever there's privatization, there's efficiency. We have to look ahead. In the next 4-year cycle, we can move a long way to have a more modern country, a simpler country, able to attract more wealth, more people, responsibly, respecting the environment. I think we can do that. We can pull it off. On to Fabio from Hidrovias, Brazil. What are your expectations for the years to come? And what is the role of transportation in the development of the country? Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to share the stage with Wilson and Santos Brasil. I'll try to contribute to his brilliant explanation. I'll be talking about multimodality systems. Logistics has to be regarded as a whole, as a system. That's one of the pillars of our investment strategy. 12 years ago, why is it that the country with the largest river extension in the world, we did not transport that? That was the problem was logistics integration. You have to have loading and unloading capabilities and efficiency transportation. With large scales, you cannot do that in any riverbank. You need transshipment facilities and efficient exports terminals. So integration is key to us. This has always limited what Brazil does because we are a large producer inside the farm. It can be on a farm or even on a mine all the way to the port. You waste a lot of value in that stretch when you have to take 40 tons of soybeans from Sorriso in northern Mato Grosso all the way to southern Brazil. Whenever there's a waterway, you should use it. If you need a railway, put a railway in place. We are a country of continental proportions, and we need a multimodal system. 56 years ago, we adopted the highway system. That's a legacy that we inherited, and we are changing that little by little. We've doubled how important river transportation is in our matrix. We still have a little over 2,000% of bulk cargoes through rivers. US, Europe, and Canada, they have almost twice as much, over 5%. China, it's 23% of all the bulk transportation is through rivers or waterways. There's no more efficient mode of transportation than waterways. Having rivers does not necessarily mean that you have a waterway. You have to have maps, signaling. We're moving ahead. We're moving along. We must unbottle logistics in the country so that logistics is not the bottleneck for growth. We talk about Mato Grosso as the largest agriculture producer in the world. Could it have grown even more? Yes, it could. The limitation is logistics. Railways, waterways are not enough. We're trying to close that gap. So our goal is to be here together at Cubo, the leading innovation hub in Latin America. We want to foster innovation and technology in these industries. Fabricio talked about the first tugboat. We have the first tugboats of that kind in southern Brazil as well. So innovation is part and parcel of what we do. CapEx has to yield returns, but the OpEx has to be low. We've been obsessed by being a logistics provider that is low cost. So the outlook is positive. We have come a long way, expanding the multimodal system. We still have a lot to go. To give you the efficiency, just to give you some numbers, when you transport in terms of kilometers, 1 ton of cargo with the equivalent of energy of 1 gallon of fuel, the highway is about 110 kilometers with 1 gallon worth of fuel per ton. Railway, 370 kilometers with the same gallon of fuel. Waterways, 950. The river transportation is 10 times more efficient than trucks, on top of polluting a lot less. We operate in biomes in the Amazon River Basin, in the Paraguayan Chaco. Engines vibrate a lot less. We have the first, they're usually push boats or maneuver push boats being built in the beloved shipyard in Bahia. So we're introducing these new technologies to bottlenecking the logistics system in Brazil, fostering multimodal transportation and logistics overall. All right, thank you. Let me now point out the two issues of integrating several modes of transportation. It can be denied, or it cannot be denied, that we have come a long way with the new legal framework. And towards the end of this administration, they were talking about a river system or river transportation system for the country, just like we've done on our coast. Do you believe that these initiatives will be continued, or are we running the risk of having some discontinuity when we change administrations? I think they should move along. There's no point in going back. I agree with what you said. We live in a democracy. We have solid institutions. There's no room for going back that way anymore. So the Brazilian network, everything in that sense will be welcome. The same thing is going to be applied for rivers, that national integrated system. There's no point in having tolls in rivers and not providing anything else in return. But that's not how it worked in the coastal area of Brazil. It's going to be more dynamic. And the national system for rivers should follow suit. We have that river basin that underused. the waterways of Tocantins, for example. That could be an alternative to all the right-of-way bottlenecks we have in the north-south border. Tucuruí, a hydroelectric power plant, and there's no unblocking of the Lorenzo River system. So we have to start executing these or implementing these projects. But that's something we shouldn't lose sight of, the fact that the government is now more professional. There's no room for going back, as I said, because that's the lever for moving forward into unblocking the roads. We shouldn't depend on trucks. They're key. Trucks are key in short distancing. But when it comes to 3,000 kilometers, when we compare it to railways and waterways, that destroys the value. Inside the farm or inside the mines, we're very efficient. Outside, we're talking about waterways, and that's international market. We're still paying a penalty from the farm, from the mine, all the way to the ore. There's no turning back, as I said. Before I turn over to Fernando, let me invite all of you, if you want to submit questions, just read the QR code on the screen. Fernando, over to you.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to make it known that I'm very happy about this event. I think it demonstrates very clearly how we work together, or at least how we intend to work together, with a lot of collaboration. I think we need to think about having a greater perspective than only our companies. So there's a lot of convergence here. We have similar agendas. So having collaboration with companies that we like so much is an honor. And it will be difficult to answer after my brilliant colleagues. Antonio Carlos talked a lot about simplification of taxes and the tax reform. So that would be very important. And Fabio also mentioned being multimodal, which is at the core of our agenda. So maybe I'll focus a little bit more on reinforcing the importance of maritime and river transportation as an alternative, as a way of generating wealth and development in Brazil. This is at the core of the global economy to have this kind of transportation. It represents 90% of what is traded in the world. In Brazil, we have a lot of space to grow, but it's already a significant item on our agenda. We have imported and exported about 20 trillion through our ports, which is a large percentage of our GDP. But besides the economic dimension, it also plays an important role of having social development. Our industries create many jobs. A significant number of people are employed by our industries. These are segments that integrate Brazil in a very important way and impact their neighboring communities around the ports, around railways and transportation hubs. And it's a good way of developing and advancing our industry. So these are very important elements. Brazil is a country that, as Ricardo mentioned, has 42,000 kilometers of navigable waterways with a coast of that is so long, I mean, over 9,000 kilometers. This is fertile ground to receive multimodal transportation. And it makes this sort of maritime transportation into an essential part of our country's development. So I would just like to briefly talk about the importance of this industry, how significant it will be for our development. Um, and I think that's very important. And just to conclude, I think when we consider the potential that we have to grow, that figure I mentioned, 25% of the Brazilian GDP, when you look at Latin America, this share goes up to 50% of their GDP. So I think that clearly demonstrates the potential that we still have. It really is huge. If you reach the average that we have in Latin America, will mean that you have doubled your share. So I think these are my remarks. Great, thank you. We received a question from an analyst, Lucas Marchiori from BTG Pactual. Thank you. So he's asking to Antonio, if you could tell us about the development scenario for the Port of Santos with the new federal administration, especially considering the privatization and the STS-10 auction. To give you some context, one of the biggest flags for this new administration was to privatize the Port of Santos, but we will still have to wait for an auction. And the transition team for the next administration has already shown signs that it is not favorable to privatizing it under the current model. So, Fernando, what is your perspective on that? Do we have some room to convince the new administration, or will we need to adapt it and focus on other accessory services? Hi, Lucas. Good afternoon. Thank you for that question. I think that the proposal that was made by Tarcísio was very bold. I think it can only be paralleled in Australia. We supported the proposal when it was put out. We considered it to be viable. I don't think it was ever concluded. I think it was at the final stages, and I think that it would still advance in the last round of negotiations, but I think that this is in the past. I think that the new administration will not follow this path, but I don't think that it will remain as it is right now. I think that a part of the Port Authority can be privatized, and I also think that this will be what the private industry or the private sector is going to try to get from the government. I think port authorities have a huge importance across all of Brazilian logistics because riverways, waterways take you to a port. Hidrovias do Brasil does that. Railways take you to a port. So if terminals are private, they're very efficient, they're world class, but you need a public authority to dredge, to create access, to integrate, to remove bureaucracy from the legal and inspection areas. So we don't have any continuity. We're going through a wonderful moment right now. We've had other wonderful moments, but they're not constant. We do have in several parts of Brazil discontinuities in development policies. And that is holding us back, not only in the ports, but across all of Brazil. And it's become anachronical. It must happen, probably not as this administration has planned for it, but I think maritime access and waterway access will progress. Dredging, anything that requires high investments. We can't forget that we've gone beyond what is sustainable in government debt. We don't have any money. Brazilian society has no way of paying for infrastructure investments. It needs to come from the private sector. And we still have a huge section of investments that need to be done every day because you need to dredge the port every day. You need to fix the port every day. You can't expand a terminal if you don't have a bridge or a road that will get there, if you don't have any access and turns. So port authorities are the biggest driver for this type of development. So I think he asked a bit about STS-10, and I think that this terminal was connected to the port's privatization. I think we're back to square one. I think that the group is talking about this. People who are dealing with logistics in the transition group are very able. They know the ports, the issues that Brazilian ports have, but we're optimistic. I think we'll continue to progress. We progressed a lot in the last 4 years, as I mentioned, and I think we're still going to continue progressing in the next 4 years. So, Fernando, what do you think about the government's privatization program? Do you think it will change? Will it be concluded? Are we still going to be talking about port privatization in the next administration? Well, first of all, I think it's still early to have a clear assessment on this issue. I think any changes or any transition will naturally reduce the rhythm. So anyone who's coming in needs to understand what is being proposed. So obviously, and I'm talking about the statements made during the electoral campaign, it doesn't seem like Brazil doesn't have such an aggressive perspective on privatizations. That being said, I think we'll have to wait and see. The pace of the pipeline or the speed will be affected, but on the other hand, I think that it's a very important topic. I mean, we need to be more efficient. The government needs resources. I think that these elements are pressuring, investments need to be made. The government's investment capacity is limited, so it needs the private sector. So I think the bases or the initial factors are still there. Of course, it will still be there, but it will be slower because we're going through a transition and the new administration needs to understand it and make a great, define them because we need to understand, from the different areas who will be the leader for these processes. We need to know who the stakeholders are. This will be clear soon so that we can make a better assessment on it. Thank you, Fernando. Fabio, your assessment?
I think we have to discuss that at the macro level. Well, it's more prone to privatization or not. We know that at the macro level, but I agree with you. Of course, we have to keep on pushing projects nonetheless. We've seen improvements in the railway, cabotage, the national system for the sea. Anyway, there have been specific projects or the transfer over to the private sector because it does not necessarily mean the need for privatizing the port. Let me give an example. On top of the ports, that you now have to have at least 25% of the cargo to own a terminal. That does not make any sense. You cannot be a thoroughbred logistic provider. When Hidrovias do Brasil was founded, we always believed that there was that demand because we had a trading company. We would be losing that tax exemption. Whenever we had a trading company in our stock in our shareholders' composition. But it's no longer the case. Back in 2015, that was lifted. You can have a private terminal now, not depending on that. The railway legal framework now. You have authorization requests popping up left and right. So there's no space for going back, as I said. We cannot afford for that to happen. We have to remain professional. We have to have skilled people in key positions there. It's just an incredible reaction because port authorities want to look at what is best for the city plan around the port. So we have to be vigilant so that we don't take a step back as far as we have to have an impartial management of all these requests. The fact that the administration is more prone to privatizations and not be an impediment to what we've been doing. Our take is very similar to a more technical and pragmatic approach that we should have, and the quality of that negotiation, that discussion, of that granting power. So we have to be very concerned because we are paying attention. That would be a huge step back if the process is less technical and more political. So that should remain our focus, because if we maintain the technical level of that discussion, the fundamentals we talked about before will be there and will be able to push us ahead. And how can the private sector maintain those developments? I believe that the private sector, the companies that are represented here today, have been trying to contribute to that dialogue. The technical discussion, it's a two-way street. You have to be discussing with people who are in the know, people who know the business and are willing to listen to you. That's key in any negotiation. The way we see it, it has been happening. Just like Fabio said, we have to be close and very attentive. Not only the private sector, but society as a whole should be paying attention to these developments to prevent that replacement of technical people with political people. We have to maintain the conversation technical in a nutshell. When I look back, I think we have to look back at times to understand how the process evolves. I think we have come a long way. A lot of people from the technical team that play an important role today, they've been in that position for quite some time. They've been under other transitions, other administrations. To a certain extent, I remain hopeful that we're going to maintain that quality of that technical discussion. Over to Fabio. My question is about the export of Brazilian commodities. Waterways are important to the exports of commodities, but there are still bottlenecks there. How to remove them? How can we promote exports even further through investment? Yeah, that's a very good question. The least they get in the way, it's a very regulated industry. Well, that's a major challenge. Navigation is clear. Once you follow the Navy rules and you specify the assets, you can move along rivers. When you try to regulate the industry instead of bringing in competitiveness, you end up removing it. You have waterways that are way more organized. One of the oldest treaties, that's the Veracruz Treaty that regulates the Paraná-Paraguay waterways. It's organized. Bolivia, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay and Argentina are involved. So Brazil has what it takes to be very successful in that sense. So we have to be careful when you try to regulate the industry, not to be a burden. If you do properly, then it's fine. You need more mapping, more or clearer definitions between energy generation and navigation. We do not operate Tietê Paraná. It's small. We are in the Amazon River Basin, Paraná, Paraguay system, and we do cabotage because there's always, whenever there's a conflict between power or energy generation and navigation, we end up losing out. We cannot afford to be out of operations for 2 years, just like we did. If you have regulations that can address that conflict between power generation and navigation, if it addresses signaling and standardization of operations in Paraná, Paraguay, because you actually touch 4 countries. If you have different countries, it's going to be, a madhouse, just like we say in the state where I'm come from. We know we have come a long way. The Northern Arch, that's great. In the state of Mato Grosso, for example, whatever was produced in Mato Grosso in 2014, less than 20% moved through the Northern Arch. 56% will move through the Northern Arch. That's a major shift for that new logistics corridor. Well, that's the way I see it. Going back to integration and multimodality, we have a program called Paperless Convoy. It takes me 2 to 3 days for bureaucracy, paper going back and forth. There's no point in having physical invoices. Even here, we have one of the projects of operational excellence is the paperless convoy. That's one of the initiatives we have to have in place to promote multimodality and, of course, encourage Hidrovias in our case, and also cabotage to expand even further the potential to have an increase by 5 or by 10 if you compare it to China. Before I turn over to the other speakers, I would like to invite those in the audience. If you want to send a question, just raise your hand. You can speak into the mic and ask your question. Fernando, over to you. Leopoldo, let me just make 2 quick comments. Let me just exemplify the quality of this type of transportation system. We operate a navigation route in the country that supplies our Rio Grande terminal from the north of Lagoa dos Patos all the way to our terminal. So it brings cargo in Porto Alegre region. With 2 barges, we have 4 scales a week. We have efficiency, we have quality of service, safety. We have 130 customers there. What's a very competitive system, therefore? The other comment I would like to make is that Brazil has a very interesting opportunity, especially with agribusiness when compared to China. And we have to be prepared to capture that opportunity. Specifically about soybeans and corn. China is the #1 importer of both soybeans and corn. Corn, for example, 0 is exported from Brazil. 2/3 of imports from China comes from the US, and the other third from the Ukraine. For obvious reason, you had that supply disruption from Ukraine. But there's that concern. China is concerned about the concentration in the US. So there is that corn, opportunity for corn. China was very skeptical as to GMO corn we have in Brazil, but now they're more flexible this year. So we do have a new marketplace with an interesting scale. In case of soybeans, 85% of soybeans that China produces or uses is imported. We have an important market share there, but there's room for improvement in soybeans as well, because of a very peculiar reason. China consumes pork. They consume half of the pork production in the world. And those herds were destroyed because of the swine flu in 2018. And they have been speeding up in that herd with a lot more quality, with biosecurity in their farms, on their farms. So the feed for that production is soybeans and corn. So there's room. There's a very strategic window of opportunity for Brazil there too. I think that Brazil is in a privileged position right now. The world is going through a transformation. We had the pandemic that showed how fragile our logistics system is. It scared all of us. Logistics were more efficient and safety because of competitive, but we didn't know it was that fragile. So the capital today is looking for alternatives as far as China is concerned, investments in other countries. But there's another very relevant point, which is in the favor of Brazil, which is CO2 emissions. The maritime industry accounts for 15% of carbon emissions in the world. China accounts for 30%. You have that commitment of 1.5 degrees by 2040. It can no longer be achievable, and the consequences are catastrophic. Society is now opening its eyes to these facts. Our energy mix is very clean. Brazil and Norway are way ahead of the rest of the world. So we had that huge potential to attract investments. I was surprised when I looked at the offshore wind farms in northeastern Brazil. It's already underway. So we're having a more and more, a cleaner and cleaner economy. Now it's mandatory to use cleaner fuels in vessels. And just next year, most of the fleet will have to reduce speed to emit less carbon. In other words, we need production near shore in the Western world. And with our energy matrix, with our production matrix for food production, we can go back to industrializing back again. You can start producing consumer goods with a much better carbon footprint. So we are very well positioned. The sea system called BR of the sea, you don't see effects because you do not have vessels. You can have a vessel along the coast, but they were not available. Now we do, because the market is going back to business as usual. So there are several opportunities. In those transition times, opportunities arise. The maritime system, cabotage, Hidrovias is an example. Wilson Sons with their entire chain of tugboats, of shipyards along the coast. It's a very successful case in Brazil. So the industry has never been so well positioned to attract investments because of these changes we see in the world and due to the fact of how much we have evolved in terms of regulation and infrastructure, and still have the carbon market yet to be explored. You talked about BR do Mar. As to the regulation of this sea system, what's Wilson Sons' take on this incentive to cabotage? Is the regulation is regulations are regulations being well explored? Okay, let me take a step back. Just like Fabio said, our focus had always been on highways. It remains a very important means of transportation. And due to the fact it's a country of continental proportions, something we've said time and time again here, it doesn't make any sense not use waterways and cabotage as alternatives as far as efficiency is concerned. Let me mention a few of the competitive advantages of cabotage. We've talked about sustainability, emissions, and the carbon footprint is way better. We have more security. You have less damage, theft. You have way more predictability for the service. So companies can actually plan their transportation strategies. And efficiency is second to none when it comes to fuel consumption. To move the same amount of cargo, you use up 1/8 of fuel when you compare it to highway transportation. So the advantages are clear. Let me put that in context. This operation I mentioned before with 2 barges, in 2021, we moved worth 20,000 trucks that were off the highways. It's just undeniable how much better it is. The BR of the sea, or the sea system that was implemented to encourage cabotage, and you can lease foreign vessels. You don't have to have a Brazilian fleet to operate a cabotage system. That cuts a lot of red tape and make our lives much easier. We like it. It's an important system, but it has to be accompanied by a much better planning structure for the system. And we have to come up with that framework of policies. We have to simplify. We have to cut the red tape. And this is an important topic. And I mean, expanding concessions time frame so that they can be more attractive economically speaking. This is a relevant topic in the way I see it. And above all, we need some government policies in place to ensure that we have a healthy and egalitarian competitive scenario. Ultimately, we have to encourage producers and benefit end users. That's what we have to keep doing. So BR do Mar, this new infrastructure for the sea, it's not enough. We need more, but that's an important initial first step. Yes, it has to be complemented by other policies. In recent years, especially because of the pandemic, global logistics chains suffered substantially. We had that logistics chaos that affected every country, including Brazil. Let me piggyback on the comment that you just made. During those crises, opportunities arise. The way Santos Brasil sees this new rearrangement of geopolitics in the world, what opportunities are out there for Brazilian logistics operators? Are there any windows of opportunities up for grabs?
Look, I think this refers to what I had said before. In Brazil, it's important to organize the logistics chain, organizing and cleaning it, and reducing carbon consumption. So, for example, Tecon Santos has 10 kilos of carbon emissions per container moved. In most European terminals, it's 20, almost twice as much. And ship owners are receiving demands on that. They have their backs against the wall. So in Brazil, you can offer credit to your client who is a ship owner. And I think if terminals are able to advance and certify their own decarbonization process, then they'll have a huge advantage in the Brazilian competitive scenario. I think we are carbon neutral in scope 2, and we're continuing to work to be carbon neutral in scope 1 for at least 80% of our emissions. So that's the direction we're going towards, and this is in line with what most major navigation companies are doing. And I mentioned this before, Brazil will benefit from this trend, not only from food production, but we can also provide services in this concept for the East. So we're going to create more trade in Brazil that will generate a higher demand for Brazilian port facilities. So after the COVID pandemic, now that logistics chains have normalized, we received in the port of Santos the new Panamax vessel. And this is really going to change all of our logistics on the coast because we're going to have a higher concentration in ports that have a draft, that have a size that can receive these vessels, and that's going to increase the demand for cabotage. So a part of it is feeder for these larger ports, and half of it is domestic. So that's a virtuous cycle as well. You're going to increase your cabotage operations, especially with the BR do Mar, and this will increase demand in all Brazilian ports, not because you're going to increase foreign trade, but because you're going to remove cargo from roads, as was said before. And there's a large flow from the south and southeast to the north of Brazil. The north of Brazil produces what they don't consume and consume what they don't produce. So that creates a huge amount of flow. And this is a great market for cabotage. So I think that's a major opportunity. Transshipment numbers at Santos Brasil are over 30%. And it's all in this kind of service offered to the coast. And it will continue to grow. As concentration goes up, these vessels are already available. We'll save a lot of fuel per container, and that will leverage domestic cabotage. You're going to need larger vessels with lower emissions and lower costs per containers. I think we're in a great transformative moment. And as I said before, there are many opportunities that will arise, but we need to be aligned with the future, with decarbonization, with efficiency, with technology. We need to have connections. We're starting to open the door to B2C. So there are clients that are using port logistics to delivered to their end client. And the cultural transformation of that is huge. So logistics operators and everyone else needs to get ready for this scenario. Great. And Fabio, what opportunities do you see in this new scenario? Yeah, I agree with Antonio Carlos. I think Brazil has lost many waves, and it should not miss the next one. We can stand out and we can be examples for the world of a sustainable market. So we talk about ESG. When it comes to E, we're talking about the environmental side of things, but we also need to pay attention to the social challenges that we have in Brazil. We have a clean energy matrix. We're examples for the world, although we don't um, communicate that very well. We're examples. And when you explore cabotage, when you look at river transportation, the social impact of the environments we find ourselves in is minimal in comparison to opening up a road. So when you use that old model of opening up a road, that creates a legacy of problems. You have that issue of the fish bone, because then you need other roads that will take you to a central road that will lead to problems in illegal mining, child prostitution, which is a disaster and is inadmissible. When you talk about cabotage and riverways, that never happens. So 70,000 tons of cargo on a river. So we're transporting in Panamax vessels in Brazilian rivers without creating any impact, without affecting local communities. They just see convoys going through. And, as vessels become more electric, you won't see even noise and pollution. So what I mean to say is that we cannot lose this, we cannot miss this wave. We need to stand out and sustainable development. And we need to be sustainable in a broader sense, E, S, and G. So I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have to stand out. And it will be very frustrating if Brazil misses this wave again. I think it might. We need to hold it because we have everything it takes to stand out. We have the right power matrix, we have a good transportation grid, we have a much more careful development model, and we need to show it. So we need to look at everything else. I was raised in the Amazon. I went there with my father in '74 with to open up a bauxite mine, and now we transport that bauxite. But I lived there from the age of 6, and that's something that we need to be very careful with. It's a very small balance, so you really cannot tear open a road in that biome. So that's how the model needs to go. It needs to look at the social aspects of it as well. I was in an immersion in the Amazon with Bartolomeo from Vale. We were on a ship for 3 days, and the lesson I got from that experience is that the social side of things is the biggest bottleneck, much more so than the environmental side of things. Great. And Fernando, what opportunities does the Wilson Sons Group see? Well, I agree with what Antonio Carlos and Fabio said. And just to make a broader comment, I think that Brazil is well positioned right now as a country. Brazil has a huge relevance in the food chain. We have a clean energy matrix, and we are role models. And we need to be recognized as such. And I think also Brazil is playing an important role in the green economy. In the future, we will be even more critical. So I think we have very strong elements. For the West, Brazil is facing a much lower level of resistance than China, for example. So I think we have a favorable environment, similar to what Fabio mentioned before. that is very positive. We have positive momentum. We're moving in the right direction. I think that private economic institutions have played their role. I think we're all trying to invest on efficiency and innovation in a sustainable way, in a way that is increasingly sustainable. So Fabricia mentioned that we're on the our companies are among the our ports, excuse me, are among the top 50 most efficient in the world. So I think we're doing our share, but I think we still need an institutional environment that does not get in the way, that can run this process in a more natural fashion. What Antonio Carlos mentioned in the beginning of our conversation was that we needed to simplify things, especially regulatory and tax simplification. We need to continue advancing in getting the gains that we have been getting in providing more efficiency to our industry, maintaining um, more technical discussion, and I think all of it will create a positive scenario for the industry in Brazil. And it's an opportunity that I really hope for. I hope we don't miss this boat. Thank you. We received a question from Wagner Salavehi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. To Fabio from Hidrovias. What size can the North Arch reach, and what competition do you see from railways? Are they a competition for waterways, or will they benefit from the growth in Mato Grosso with this additional section being built in Lucas do Mato Verde? Well, I see this competition between different modes in a different way. I don't think that we're competing for market share. I think it will take a while. I wish it were faster, but I think it will take some time for us to become a Switzerland. But before that happens, we will see a bigger gap in infrastructure than what we can make up for. So there are two corridors in the North Arch that still are growing. From Rondonópolis, they're very competitive in the south of Mato Grosso, and the other one will be very competitive for the north. So that lack of infrastructure is the limiting factor for growth. It's not the opposite. And I think it will still take a long time. I hope that we have to compete for cargo even before we expect it, but I don't think that will happen because we have a huge gap on infrastructure. So it becomes a virtuous cycle. Instead of limiting production because you don't have a logistical competition, you start encouraging competition. And the North Arch is a clear example of that. Before, when you had a single exit to the ports in the north, the more the agricultural frontier moved north, the further away it was from transshipment. And why did Mato Grosso have more cattle in the north and agricultural commodities in the south? Because they needed higher added value cargo to face a good price with shipping. But now we have feedlots closer to the consumers, and these logistical vectors are changed. The north, the closer you are to the north, the closer you are to transshipment. So that's not pushing the agricultural boundaries anymore. And there's another important point. I've heard 14 and 17 million hectares of degraded area to move the agricultural border to the north without having to tear down a tree. This is not deforestation. We can be very rigorous on that. So I don't think it will be, winner takes all. I think that not developing alternative corridors will be a waste for the industry. We need to support it. And the North Arch is an example of that. If you think we're removing cargo from each other, well, that's not true. Both corridors are growing very well, and they are making the agricultural industry more competitive, and which will generate more cargo. So right now we're about half and half. The north corridor is doing a little bit better. When Southern Logistics extend the railway to the north, and when we defend the creation or um, the construction of what we call the ferrogrão, we're trying to reduce that gap. So I hope that both modals can grow in the same direction, because that's going to create logistic competition, which will create more arable land, and then you're no longer being stopped from growing because you don't have logistics, and you're going to become more competitive. Fernando, Lucas Marchiori from BTG Pactual is asking you to talk about the recent performance of the towage operation, how pricing is doing, and if we will see better volumes next year as container shortages go away. Well, we are extremely pleased at how the towage market is going. At Wilson, we have 80 tugboats operating in over 30 ports in Brazil. This year, we had a recovery on our price. Now we have an efficient operation when it comes to cost. We had mentioned some of the elements of our operational efficiency which make a big difference. For example, our operations center. We can control the speed of all tugboats through it, and we can find the ideal consumption rate for all of the maneuvers. And this makes a big difference when you're at a scale. That conserves your margins. But this is a market that is much better balanced today. When you look at the global reference market from more mature markets around the world, some of them have fewer players than the Brazilian market. The Brazilian market still is very spread out. It has been consolidating to some degree, but this consolidation has been, has not affected the efficient market players, and it hasn't increased capacities as well. So that's very important. These inorganic operations that sometimes appear consolidate, but they don't remove balance from the market. In our case, our financial performance has been fantastic. We've made use of this price efficiency and our better cost efficiency. But for next year, we really hope that the container market will recover. But for towage, the container market is only one of several elements. It's important to look at what's going to happen to the global economy. As Fabricia said, in the towage segment, we service 50% of the vessels on the Brazilian coast of any nature, of any market. So the correlation that we have with the trade chain, which correlates a lot with the global economic level, is very significant in towage. So it's important to take note of it and see how economies are responding next year. That will allow us to see how we are working with containers, if we'll be offset in volume in other areas. It's difficult to be specific today, but I think we're well positioned to continue operating it well and capturing value from the market next year. So Fernando, since you have the microphone, we have a question from Pedro Fontana from Bradesco. So he mentions that it was a good moment for the offshore segment, considering the investments in oil and gas. And we're starting to see the offshore market developing in Brazil, including oil and gas companies. So how is Wilson Sons positioning itself to service this new segment? And will you need investments to adapt your OSV fleet? And when do you expect to start servicing this industry? Okay, let me answer that. First, it's important to say this. We've been seeing significant improvements and recoveries in the oil and gas industry. And we understand that this trend will continue in the next few years. With that being said, I think that there is some direct applicability for our assets in the oil and gas industry. So we see a recovery in the fleet utilization in Brazil, and prices are also going up again. 2023 is still a transition year for this market, and that means that you will still see some significant improvements in activities and price, but you also have a relatively high movement to invest in modernizing assets. The offshore wind market, and I believe that was the question asked, is promising in Brazil, and when you look at the companies that are in the oil and gas industry, in the offshore market, they have different levels of specialization. So in our case, our specialization level is lower, meaning that we are at an advantage. Less specialized assets are interchangeable, meaning that you can adapt it quickly to different markets. We still don't have a clear and exact view on the level of investments that will be required. We need to understand how deep these adaptations will be, but we understand that our starting point for these assets to service this new market is very interesting. Now, this market requires regulatory discussions. There's a number of important forums that are now getting organized to talk about offshore. We're present there, so we have our eye on it. We're paying attention, and we're starting to position ourselves to maybe service this market and use our new assets, considering the medium and long term, and seeing this market as an alternative for monetization.
Well, Santos Brasil is diversifying its operations now to include containers and vehicles, and now we're starting out with liquid bulk cargo. What are the challenges, especially in those regions in the northern arch? Are you having any hurdles along the way? No, quite the opposite. Everything we thought about is being proven to be right. This is the new agricultural frontier in southern Piauí, northern Tocantins. That's the region we call Matopi. And it uses up a lot of diesel oil. It's being growing substantially. Grazing land is being replaced by agriculture per se. It's way more equipment intensive, fuel consumption intensive. We've invested in 3 terminals. We have 50,000 cubic meters that is ready. We are investing at full speed to have an extra 150,000 cubic meters for oil, diesel oil, to supply Wilson Sons tugboats, trucks that transport soybean the last mile, all the combines for the agribusiness. We had our first ship in 15 days. It's now operational. the first 25% of the operation has been concluded. And there's more. And there's the exports of biodiesel, the blend with biodiesel, biofuels in general. So this is something new to Santos Brazil. We wanted to be in that industry, and our thesis is 100% adherence to agribusiness. Brazil is second to none in terms of agribusiness. We are key for the production of protein in the world. If we had the chance to have 100% of the project completed, we'll be able to sell that capacity. We are very optimistic about that growth driver. We are integrated with all the other ports. This is an asset-light business. We can grow and leverage the business with very little capex, and we have been investing heavily in the Tecon Santos, the terminal we have in Santos. That terminal is growing. The port is growing. The change of that container terminal can provide a lot of return on the capital. It's, again, better than anything else. So we are facing that tailwinds over 300 million. Next year, we'll be investing 600 million. And we'll keep on growing. New businesses, new bidding activities or acquisitions in these three vectors. But undoubtedly, the number one driver for growth in logistics is agribusiness. Undoubtedly. So we are doing whatever we can to meet the needs of that industry. So let's move on to the final round of questions. I was told to wrap things up. Let me ask you a final question about 2023. What's the number one opportunity next year for the industry? And also what will be the number one risk? I am an optimist. I remain optimistic, just like my colleagues. We had that hiccup, which major water crisis. That's part of our business. You are subjected to the seasonality of river levels. But the last crisis happened 90 years ago. We hope we have more water to operate in the Paraná-Paraguay river basin, not in the Amazon region. I remain optimistic. As I said, the crop is looking very good. We probably will have a bumper crop. We remain competitive as far as ore is concerned, regardless of any weather conditions. So the outlook remains very favorable for next year. Fernando, the way we see it, and based on what we discussed, we are all optimistic about the future. 2023 can be a very positive year for our industry. Well, having said that, you also asked about the risk. The risk is that of the international scenario and how European economies react, how the American economy reacts. This is very important to us in that overall plan, or that international scenario. And we have to pay close attention to what the new administration will do in infrastructure. It's not a risk, the way I see it. So much more the need to understand what they do. If everything happens according to plan, according to what we expect, we believe that 2023 is going to be a very good year. Well, I agree with his opinion as far as the risks can be opportunity. China is opening up to other markets to not be that dependent on the American market. Global commodity flows and what we're going to do with this new administration, that's what we have to. I did not answer the question about risk. I would have answered the same thing. Just like Fabio said, if agribusiness is doing okay, our GDP will be fantastic. Next year, our GDP is expected to grow, and this is good for our industry. And to be more specific, in the container business, we have high hopes that with the new supply of new ships, we'll have an increase in cabotage operations and more space in Brazil. And this is going to be good for all ports in Brazil. And when we talk about risk, we are talking about this systemic risk, a world with a war in Europe, an energy crisis, a very dry Europe, inflation rates through the roof, recession looming in the US, that changes the exchange rate and everything else. So we expect the world to address these major issues, that we can move away from that pandemic and go through the war with less turbulence than what we're having today. That in fact that impacts interest rates, devalue our assets. It's difficult to have credit access. Equity markets suffer, so we have to pay attention to the macroeconomics and to what's going on abroad. So 2023 is a year to look outward and the risks in-house. Let me end on a positive note. There's an important element, which is to regulate logistics chains in the country. That used to be a hurdle for the industry. And we do hope that 2023 things can begin to change. The number of cancellations at ports is going down, and we hope that regulation to come, it will be very welcome. We can have a way more predictable operation, and Antonio Carlos knows that very well. We operated 80% with predictability and 20% on the spot market. During the crisis, these numbers changed dramatically. That affects efficiency. So that concludes the second session of our seminar. Thank you for those of you that are here in the office and those of you online through the MZ Group webcast. Thank you, Antonio Carlos Sepúlveda, Fernando Salek, Wilson Sons, and Fabio Schettino from Hidrovias, Brazil. And the CFOs that spoke in the first portion of our presentation on behalf of Brazil Export and B News newspaper, thank you once again for having me as a mediator. That concludes our seminar. Thank you.